let's talk about my worst books of the year. I read 214 books this year, and I read a lot of great books, but I also read a lot of shit. So let's just get into the 10 worst books I read this year. So coming in at number 10, the best of the worst, shall we say, is Once a Myth by Pepper Winters. I've read Pepper Winters books in the past and enjoyed them, some more than others, but I believe this is probably my third or fourth book by her, and this one is by far my least favorite. Once a Myth started off with a very familiar premise for Pepper Winters, so familiar in fact it's actually how one of her most popular novels started, and it actually kind of crossed over with that as the main character in this novel actually got to interact with the main character of that novel. What was that novel called? I have no fucking idea because I can't remember. But it was the first book I read last year, actually. It was called... I thought that if I did that I would remember. Tears of Tess. That's what it was called. That was not worth the amount of effort it took. So it starts with a girl on vacation who gets kidnapped and ends up in the hands of some rich dude. Except this rich dude happens to own this like mysterious island where all these rich people come to fulfill their greatest fantasies. If that sounds familiar, yes, I do realize that it sounds like Jeffrey Epstein's island. I just realized that now, and that's uncomfortable. In this fantasy world that Pepper Winters has created, the girls love being there for reasons unknown. I mean, they try to explain it, but it doesn't matter. The interesting part of this novel comes with the idea that there is this drug that the girls take that essentially turns them into animals, writhing animals in heat who just want to fuck everything that moves, and they therefore enjoy the sexual experience. I didn't particularly love the main character. I mean, she's just your garden variety type of dark romance character that you get where she's like stubborn but also like super attracted to the main dude, and that's really it. I've seen these types of main characters over and over again to the point where I am desensitized to them and they just all blend together for me. The love interest also didn't have much of a characterization beyond being rich and hot, which once again I've seen a lot in these types of novels. That tends to be the case, which is interesting because these types of male love interests are always portrayed as some like rare gem when in actuality they are the exact same throughout every single dark romance book. I think where the book really fell short is, first of all, its tone was very silly. Much more lighthearted despite all of the dark subject matter. This book sounds honestly terribly real, really. Girls getting kidnapped, sold to rich men on this island, and drugged. All of that sounds way too familiar to real life. Obviously dark and horrifying, but it's portrayed in this book as like paradise, as this amazing experience for these girls, which is insane. And honestly, a lot of it came off very silly because of how the girls react to this drug, which they call like an elixir or something instead of just calling it like rohypnol. As well as this sex machine that they really hype up. They don't call it that, but they essentially keep talking about this place where they go to have sex with their clients or whatever, and how it's this technology that makes these sexual experiences so amazing, and how they can have every fantasy fulfilled. And because they keep hyping it up and it sounds like it's going to be so cool, that's the stuff I was really looking forward to. Unfortunately, you don't get to that stuff until the very, very end of the book, and you only get one very tiny short scene to actually experience this technology. Which, obviously, there's going to be more of that in the second book, I would hope, but I can't care enough to get to that next book. I needed a little bit more in this book to make me want to go to that next one. Besides that, the other thing that was super weird was, holy crap, did they mention being vegan a lot. Which is very bizarre in an erotica book. She just really drove home her feelings about veganism and how much she hated people who ate meat. It was weird, and the debate over eating meat was really not something I wanted in my erotica novel. So I gave this 2 stars. There are probably people out here who might enjoy this, and also maybe the series gets better. I do enjoy Pepper Winters usually, so I imagine it would get better, but yeah, this book was a miss, a big miss. Number 9 is Micro by Michael Crichton and Richard Preston. Micro is essentially about a group of students who get this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to work with a company that specializes in microtechnology. But while they're also getting this opportunity, the main character's brother, who works at this company, mysteriously dies. And the brother thinks that the company has something to do with it. Essentially, once they're flown to this compound, the students end up getting shrunk to the size of the microtechnology. And they end up lost in this jungle island. I can't remember where they are. It might be Hawaii. It might not be a jungle. Now, this idea sounded so interesting to me, and I was like, yes, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Magic school bus. I'm so into this. Unfortunately, it was not all I hoped it would be. All of the characters are terribly underdeveloped. Most of them don't have any real characterization to them. They're just like one-note characters, which is really unfortunate. I also just didn't really like any of the characters, and I really didn't care if they died. I really do think that there are some people out there who could like this, but for me, I just found it way too over the top and ridiculous, and not in a fun way, just kind of in a really cheesy, annoying way. Overall, it's not a book that I strongly hated or anything, I just wish it was better than it was. The next book on this list, number 8, is City of Fallen Angels by Cassandra Clare. This is book number 4 in the Mortal Instruments series. I read the first 3 books back when I was in high school, and this year I decided to listen to them again on audiobook so I could finish the rest of the series. I loved the 3rd book. That was a book that I hadn't finished in high school, and so listening to it again, this was the first time I fully finished it, and the 3rd book was by far my favorite so far. It definitely had the most amount of action, and it just like advanced the plot so much and in such interesting ways, and I really appreciate it. The 4th book, on the other hand, I fucking hated. It was so bad. It was 90% relationship problems in the most annoying way possible, because why these characters can't just sit down and have a conversation, I will never understand. Like, I know they're teenagers, but I was not this stupid as a teenager. Also, it was just whiny. I hate whiny characters, and god damn it, these characters and their whiny problems. I just wanted to shake everyone in this book. Also, I don't care about Chase and Clary. I truly don't. Their relationship is so annoying, and just, there are so many other relationships in this series that are more interesting than them two, so why am I following them? The ending was interesting, but like, all the rest of it could have been scrapped. I didn't need the first 90% of this novel, just saying. Book number 7 on this list is The Night Swim by Megan Goldin. So I read the arc of this book back in the summer, and I really didn't enjoy it, and I was kind of surprised to see how much hype the book got after. Sometimes I think to myself, like, am I hating a book because it has so much hype, and because I have like some contrarian part of me that just like doesn't want to like the things other people like? Or do I hate a book because it has so much hype and therefore I built up expectations and it just couldn't live up to those? But then a book like this comes along and I'm like, no, I hated it before I heard how much hype it has. Night Swim is a thriller involving a podcast host who is in town to cover a rape trial. The rape trial was very reminiscent of what happened to Chanel Miller with Brock Turner at Stanford, which I think was a large part of what kind of pissed me off about this book, because I read Chanel Miller's book Know My Name this year and it was fucking fantastic, but also it just fell short in general. There is another story that's going on at the same time, which is kind of happening in letters from this girl who's sending in letters to the podcast host and telling her about her sister's death many, many years before. And they're both happening in the same town. I have so many problems with this book, but let's start with the biggest overarching one, and that is that this book is about rape, and I feel like so many people have touted it as being about rape culture and doing such a good job, but in my opinion, it's such a shallow look at rape culture. The things you read in this book are the things that you read anywhere about rape culture. They're the thoughts that you've had yourself. They're the things that you read online constantly. It's just such a surface level look at rape culture instead of really going deep into what happens to girls who experience these types of things. Once again, because I read Chanel Miller's Know My Name this year, she just does such a fantastic job in that book in just talking about every single aspect of rape culture that reading The Night Swim just kind of pissed me off. Or at least it pissed me off at how much hype it was getting, because it just didn't do the things that it was doing that well. The other things that I didn't like about the book was that the main character was not interesting at all. She had no personality other than just being like a good journalist. The fact that this is apparently going to become a series with her character makes no sense to me, because there was just nothing there that made me interested to ever read from her perspective again. The podcast element added nothing. I know they were going very much for like a serial sort of look, and it just didn't do much for me personally. I truly just think that she didn't have that much to say on the subject. The other thing is, the case in the past was so interesting that why weren't we just reading about that? Why even add the present timeline with the Brock Turner type case, except so that people can say like, oh look, this is a fictionalized version of the Brock Turner case. The ending was very obvious. It was so predictable which way it was going. It felt like it was the only way it could go. This entire book pissed me off, clearly. And it was my 7th worst book of the year. Now for the number 6 worst book I read this year, we have another thriller that I think is ridiculously overhyped. And that is The Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware. And this book was on everybody's top 10 list last year. And I read it thinking I was gonna love it, just assuming I was gonna love it, and I hated it. I had such a hard time getting through this book, I can't even tell you. So this book is about a girl who takes a nannying position and things start to go awry in the house. Spooky house vibes. Where could it go wrong? I never wanted to pick up this book. Like, every time I would read it, I would get it a couple chapters in, and then I would put down the book, and I just would not want to pick it back up again. I finished it because I thought that the ending was gonna blow my mind. I thought that's the only way people can love this, is that the ending is just so, so good. Well, let me tell you, I predicted every single thing that happened in this book from maybe the first 100 pages. It's hard not to, especially when you read just little lines or something and you automatically like get that click in your mind that like knows what that's referring to or knows what that's hinting to. So I saw most of this coming. Once again, that would be fine if the rest of the book was enjoyable. It was not. I hated this main character so much. I hated her. She was the absolute worst babysitter. She non-stop complained. It was so annoying. She tended to overreact about everything, from the way the kids acted to the creepy things that were happening in the house. Like, I felt myself constantly being like, would you calm the fuck down? I think that the storyline itself was interesting. I just don't think it was executed in any sort of interesting way. I also did not give a crap about the tech stuff. I feel like it added nothing to the story. I somehow didn't know that this was a take on Turn the Screw. I haven't read that book, but I'm assuming that even without having read the book, I've probably seen movies that have done takes on it as well, and that's probably why I saw so much of this coming. I don't know, but either way, I don't think I would have liked the book because I just hated so much of this character stuff. Now, if I didn't piss enough people off with those last 2 books, let me tell you my 5th worst book of the year, which is Punk 57 by Penelope Douglas. I know that Penelope Douglas is essentially God to the dark romance community, and I get it because she's honestly a pretty good writer. I read Bully, I also read Corrupt, and I enjoyed both of those books. I find that in the dark romance community it's sometimes hard to find people who are actually good writers beyond just their sex scenes, which she also is immaculate at. That's honestly probably her strongest point, is her sex scenes. But unfortunately, the character work in Punk 57 made me want to die a little. I said this before in my review of Punk 57, if you love Lucas and Peyton, you'll love this book. I personally absolutely hate them, and so I hated this book. No surprise there. There's nothing that irritates me more in any sort of high school story than when the super popular girl is also super emo and whiny and just like complains about how hard her life is, because I'm like, you're fine. Jesus. I think I just hated her character so much that I was never going to enjoy the rest of the book. And don't get me wrong, I can appreciate characters that aren't necessarily likable, but I have to at least find them interesting, and her character is not interesting in any way. I've seen this type of character in a million different TV shows. Anybody remember Marissa from the OC? God damn, I hated her so much. And this very much brought back those type of memories. I just had a visceral reaction to both of these characters. I didn't enjoy their interactions at all. As much as I hated her, I didn't really like him either. He was like marginally better, but his interactions with her were just beat my head against the wall annoying too. Alright, things might be in a new spot because my camera died. Hopefully I'm still in focus. Number 4 on my worst books of 2020 list is Cruel Black Hearts by Candace Wondrak. This was a smut book about two guys who are killers who hook up with this girl who writes about serial killers. That sounded like an interesting premise. I read sort of a similar book by Trisha Wolfe last year and really enjoyed it. I would definitely suggest reading that duology rather than reading this, because this was so poorly written. I can usually get over bad writing in smut because honestly it happens a lot. They're not always the greatest writers, and that's fine. But the writing in this was just so bad. I just couldn't see past it. It was so cliche. She was one of those characters that had one different eye color than the other, which for some reason has showed up in multiple smut books I've read. I don't know why that is or why writers think that makes a girl so unique. She also was so unique because of her obsession with true crime, which is the most basic bitch thing ever, and that includes me because I love true crime, but I definitely don't think that makes me unique in any way because every white girl loves true crime. They also would talk about what a great writer she was, but then they would show her writing, which you could tell was not great. I really hate when books do this because you have to be able to back up that claim. The sex scenes weren't anything mind-blowing. If they were, I would probably be fine with this. The love interests weren't that interesting either. I will say I've read a little bit about where the trilogy, or I don't know how many books there are, where it goes and how another dude gets brought in. Either way, I didn't love this book enough to keep going with the trilogy, especially because there is a twist ending which is so ridiculous and comes completely out of left field. Props to them for making it quite a twist, but I'm still not into it. Number 3 on my worst books of 2020 is the only graphic novel I have on this list, and that's the conclusion to Fables. I read some comics that weren't that good this year, but I never truly hated them enough to put them on here, but the conclusion of Fables definitely deserves to be here because it was bad. Fables is a super popular graphic novel series about essentially all the fairy tales you've ever heard. They get kicked out of their homeland and essentially have to make a community for themselves in this world. But of course, all they truly want is to go back to their world, which has been taken over by an invader of sorts, and so they have to go to war with him to get it back. I loved this series so much. I read probably half of it last year and half of it this year, and this is one of the longest series I've ever read. And so it was quite a bummer to get to the end and have the ending be so atrociously bad. I've never watched Game of Thrones, but I've heard people talk about it a lot because for a while, I mean, you couldn't not hear about it. And the way people talk about that last season is very much how I feel about this. It felt like a lot of the way the characters were acting near the end of this series just came out of nowhere. If more time had been spent doing these reversals, I think it could have worked. But the problem was they just came out of nowhere. And there was like 200 issues. You had the time to make this make sense. But no, these characters who always got along all of a sudden hated each other, and these characters who were good people for the most part were all of a sudden terrible. Like, they tried to explain it away, of course, but the reasoning was just so bad that I just didn't believe any of it, and none of the stakes felt real. I just didn't care because it just wasn't done properly. It was quite upsetting to see a series I love end so poorly. And it definitely deserves to be in my top 3 of worst things I read this year. Coming in at number 2 for worst things I read this year is Whiteland by Rosie Cranie Higgs. I got this as an ARC back in the summer, I believe, and that's when I read it. This is about a family who is on vacation, I believe in Switzerland, when all of a sudden one of the daughters starts acting weird, and it takes place from the other daughter's perspective, the sister, as she tries to figure out what's going on with her sister. This started off so strong. The mood and the vibe and the atmosphere that the writer conveys is so like rich and thick and palpable. There's just such a menacing quality to this like snowy landscape and these woods that I think she really gets right. And when I first started this, I was like, I'm gonna love this. It also started off very visceral because there is a very kind of gruesome act right at the beginning that happens, and I was like, holy shit, things are getting real right now. And I was like, how does the book go up from here? And the problem is it didn't. Much of this book takes place in the woods in this place known as Whiteland, and not a lot seems to be known about this place. While the main character tries to find out more information, everyone's just very vague and weird about it. Like, clearly the village knows about this place, but they don't want to talk about it. The problem is that while with all the talk of how menacing it is, it doesn't actually seem to be that menacing. Her and her love interest, because of course there's a love interest, spend so much time in this disorienting place, but nothing ever actually happens to them. They just walk a lot. And they really just get nowhere. And they keep talking about how it's so hard to escape Whiteland, and yet they escape like 3 times with no problems whatsoever, and then they just keep going back in. None of their motivations or decisions make any sense, especially the love interest who's there for legitimately no reason. Nothing's ever as scary as it's been talked about. I found near the end it got a little more interesting because they started talking about the lore and the myth of this place, which apparently this book is going to be a series, which is mind-blowing to me, because if there wasn't enough action in this first book, I don't know how you put this out over multiple books. I think there was an interesting idea there, but there just wasn't enough action put into the book to sustain it, because it was just a slog to get through the second half. I really had to drag myself through, and the only reason I did is because this was an arc and I wanted to review it on NetGalley, but otherwise I definitely would have DNF'd this. And the number 1 worst book of the year that I read in 2020 is The Remaking by McLeod Chapman. This is another instance of me trying horror this year and desperately wanting to love it and just being let down again and again. This is about a cursed movie production where somebody ends up dying and the movie becomes a cult classic anyway. Because of that, the movie just keeps getting remade again and again. And every time somebody dies. The movie is based on this about a girl and a mom who died. I honestly can't remember, even though I didn't even read this book that long ago. I believe I read it in October. But this book was just not good. So I think I've tried to push it out of my memory. The first little prelude section about the myth and the lore that it was based on and the folktale, I don't know what you call that, the urban legend, the local legend that it was based on was actually really interesting, and once again I was like, oh, this is gonna be good. And in part 1, the book opens up, of course, to the movie being made about this. And you get the perspective of the writer who feels he's compelled to write this movie about this legend. And you also get the perspective of the child star who's starring in this movie. Both of those perspectives were interesting. I like them. It felt like they were building up to something, like we were going to get to the end and there was going to be a big gruesome scene. And then that scene never happened, and all of a sudden we were on part 2. And part 2 comes to this movie being remade, where again we get the child actor's perspective, except now she's grown up. And they want her to be involved with this movie, with the remaking of it. I was less intrigued by her perspective this time because it had already led me astray the first time by not leading into anything. But again, it felt like we were leading up to something, like we were gonna get somewhere, like we were gonna get to some truly gruesome scene, and then we came to part 3. Because why bother showing the good stuff, you know? In part 3, we find out that the second movie was just scrapped because of the terrible things that happened on set. But of course, with part 3, they're deciding to make it again. I honestly don't even remember part 3 other than it also was building up to something and then just went nowhere, and then the book just ended. Because I remember being really mad that obviously I got no horror in this book. Why would you write a horror book and then cut out the horror scenes? Obviously, if I'm reading something that is considered horror, I want the scary bits. That's what I'm here for. I just don't get it. I just really do not recommend reading this. No matter how much you love horror, you're not gonna like this. So those were the 10 worst books that I read this year. Hopefully everyone came away from this video with their feelings intact. I really enjoy bitching about books, clearly, and I will be doing it more in my most disappointing books video, so I hope you're looking forward to that. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you come back again soon. Bye.